Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the El Rocio wash process Ecuador from Kawa Coffee. There's the bag right there. And Kawa, based out of Paris, France. And they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel multiple times before, and a coffee roaster that's quite popular with you guys as well, as I've heard so many positive things about them since our European coffee roaster tier list. This coffee caught my interest for two reasons, the first of which being that it uses a mix of the Gesha and Katura varietals, and the second being that this coffee sounds like my profile of coffee, so it felt like a great reason to revisit Kawa and check this one out, as this right here is day 46. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a more toned down recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 93 degrees Celsius, about 199 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind. Roast profile for this one, so our previous experiences with Kawa in the past have been on the lighter side of things. This one is also a filter roast, which would indicate that they roasted it a little lighter. However, I have had some much lighter coffees from Kawa in the past. This one felt like it might have had a little bit more development than it typically has. Even then, it's still on the lighter side of things by most standards and metrics, if not necessarily the most light coffee out there. Hopefully that gives you a good idea. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 24, first impression, and we opted for the V60, and it definitely yielded some pretty mixed first results, as there was a notable darker honey attribute that offered a slightly bitter aspect to it as well. In addition to that, it was offering a lot of brightness and a slightly sweet, citric, fruit-forward direction with this subtle fresh fruit aspect all hidden underneath. So it was a little bit more of this melon-like attribute, but for the most part, it felt a little uneven. It felt a little all over the board. So I felt like this coffee was going to need some notable adjustments to kind of focus it and give this one a little bit greater definition. Day 26 opted for the Chemex, and it's slightly better through this brew method, though it remains a little bit on the tame side of things, as it's offering more of that darker honey-like aspect with this generic chocolate base and some slight tropical citric brightness. It has that somewhat papery kiwi quality to it, and that's kind of hard to describe, but oftentimes when this coffee tastes a little papery, I like to associate it with kiwi because that typically seems to be the direction that people point those coffees towards. But other than that, this coffee still just felt a little bit more uneven. Some more adjustments were yet to come. As on day 29, we opted for the April brewer, and there were some more struggles, as this one felt even more unusual and uneven than the first couple of coffees we had, as the citric lemon brightness really seems to dominate the cup in a little bit more bitter and sour of a sense, continuing to be reminiscent of what I would describe as an unripened pineapple in a very strong and slightly bitter aspect, with this grassy vegetal quality as well. So huge struggles through that brew method, not necessarily ideal. We're going to continue on to day 32 as we opted for the V60 with higher temperatures. And here's the thing, I kind of knew going into that one that maybe pushing the extraction wasn't going to be an ideal solution for this coffee, but we went with it anyway. Higher temperatures, more fine of a grind, and it did feel a little better as it offered slightly more definition to the cup, with the tropical fruits being a little less sour and bitter than they had in the past. A little bit more of this lighter sweet stone fruit aspect, as well as this sweeter citric quality with a slight bit of this honey bitterness to it. So not necessarily ideal, but we're at least moving in the right direction. Day 35 opted for the Chemex with the same adjustments, and it continues to remain on the more neutral side of things, with the dark honey aspect being very prominent and pronounced yet again. A slight bit of an undefined cup, as it offers this sweet and bitter citrus that continues to remain reminiscent of this unripened pineapple. And I said to myself, I really need to kind of find a way to maybe skew those things to pull out a little bit more of the fresh fruit qualities, because they're there. I'm just really struggling to obtain them. Day 38, we went in the complete opposite directions, really lowered the temperatures, went more coarse on the grind back to normal, and then it seemed to help with the uneven harshness, as it felt significantly more balanced with greater clarity, providing much more of a focus on the tropical aspects of this coffee. It's not necessarily an overly bright cup now at this point, but it's a slightly sweeter pineapple, a softer melon, a lighter stone fruit quality, as well as a fair bit better in general, just better balanced. So that yielded some really positive results. And on day 40, best cup I had, Did the Chemex, same adjustments, and I was finding better results with the lower extraction recipes as the fruit aspects are coming through in a slightly fermenty sense. And that's one of the things that's going to be highlighted in the tasting wheel. But the stone fruit quality that was present in it reminded me a little bit of 2020's Diego Bermudez coffees, those El Paraíso coffees, where it had this somewhat, I want to say, funky stone fruit quality to it. A little bit more of this funky mango component. It did feel near natural in that sense, as it offers that in both the mango sense as well as the pineapple senses. Both of them felt a little funky. It was dominating the cup, but at this moment I was pulling out more of the fruit components than I'd experienced through any of the other days we'd had. So that's my main reason for sticking with it and picking it as my preferred recipe. Day 43, final notes, we have one more try through the V60, and it never really seemed to balance out with the V60, as it's an unusual mixture of the slightly fermenty and vibrant fruits with this strong, dark grape berry quality, unripened pineapple, funky stone fruit, not necessarily overly clean. The Chemex just seemed to provide slightly more definition to this cup. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have, looks like 4 level 4s. So let's go through this real quick. And we'll start with the finish, level 4. Yes, I don't necessarily think I have too much to add to that. It was a little funky, a little fermenty in terms of that finish. But at the very least, I was able to tone down some slight bit of the harshness that was present in this one, because right at the start, the harshness was very long lasting, and it really did seem to take away from any of the other redeeming and positive qualities of this coffee. Berry fruit, level 4. Yes, and it's something I briefly mentioned, and it was this darker berry quality to it. So at times a little bit more reminiscent of this grape-like component to it, but in addition to that, maybe some slightly more dark berries like a blackberry sort of component to it, or even darker currants. So given that there's a fair bit of bitterness to it, I can see this also present in this one. Continue on to the citrus fruit, which also scored that level 4. That may be the most defining characteristic of this one, as very early on I indicated that there was a fair bit of this citric bright quality to it, and I kept using the descriptor of unripened pineapple, and at times the citrus can feel a little bit on the sweeter side of things, but for the most part it felt on the slightly more bitter and even harsh side. So citrus present, but not necessarily in an ideal capacity. Stone fruit, level 4. Yes, and I don't read French. I don't know what the tasting notes on here actually say, but I do think that they have maybe some sort of melon note list on here. Nonetheless, I'm not entirely sure if they had anything specifically pertaining to stone fruit, but I kind of mentioned it was reminiscent of those 2020s Diego Bermudez coffees, as it had that really kind of fermenty, funky quality to it. Very interesting for a wash processed coffee, but I was experiencing that in notable abundance, enough to the point where I would say it was at least the second most defining stone fruit characteristic, or correction, fruit characteristic that was present within this coffee. We have a handful of level 3s. So I'll start with the sweetness level 3. As I always say, the requisite for me really enjoying a coffee is that we at least get the sweetness to a level 4, but this coffee at no point would I ever say was meant to be an overly sweet one. I feel like the focus of this coffee may have been skewing a little bit more in other directions, as opposed to really highlighting a lot of sweeter profiles and components of this one. I think it kind of maxed out at that level 3 mark. Acidity, level 3. Yes, and that's kind of an interesting one, because I feel like towards the end, maybe my adjustments kind of toned down the brightness of this coffee, because right at the start, I did notice a fair bit of brightness, but it was a little bit uneven. So one of my objectives was to kind of tone that down in a more even sense. So having that at a level 3, I think, is a result of the adjustments I had made from this one. Florality, level 3. Yes, and the honey bitterness that I'd mentioned a little bit more in that darker sense, that's typically what I'm associating this with. So best direction I can point something towards for that one. And then we'll go to the bitterness, level 3. Yes, and it's a bitter citric quality. It's also slightly a bitter vegetal and even grassy quality to it. So didn't necessarily love that part of the coffee. It's also a slightly bitter savory aspect to this one as well. And that's why the savoriness scores as high as it did at that level 3, as those things really seemed to play off of each other as well, giving it a slight bit of harshness as well. Body, level 3, that part is kind of interesting, especially given that it was brewed with the Chemex. So this had maybe a little bit more body than I might have been expecting, and that might have been the Caturra at play, as potentially it also could have been the origin. I just expected that, given that this was a Gesha coffee, the body might be on the slightly lower side of things, but that of course will transition to the next part, the cleanliness, level 3. That's extremely surprising. For a washed processed coffee, especially one that does have geisha, and I would really love to know the mix of how much is geisha and how much is Katora, because it didn't really seem to offer too many geisha-like characteristics to it, most specifically thinking in terms of the clarity, as this one had a slight fermentiness, it had a slight funkiness to it, and immediately when I experienced that, I said, this coffee isn't the cleanest to begin with, and experiencing this within the coffee as well does seem to take away from any sort of level 4 it might have justified just purely by being a wash processed coffee. So level 3 actually is the most fitting mark for this, and it was definitely surprising going into it, as I would have expected that to minimum reach that level 4 mark. But as I'm kind of looking at this tasting wheel, I do actually think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I was definitely surprised at the results of this one. It didn't turn out anything like I had expected, and I've had one extremely positive result with Kawa's coffees, and then the rest of them I've had mixed reviews, but this one specifically I feel like may have been the most disappointing one I've experienced going into it, because a lot of people know Ecuador is right up there, probably one of my top 3 favorite origins in the entire world right now. And this one sounded like a fun and interesting coffee. Combine the fact that the mix of varieties that it offered, as well as the descriptors that this one had, it sounds like my sort of coffee. So I fully expected going into it, experiencing a very clean, sweet, fruity, and if I was lucky, floral cup. But I didn't necessarily have the cleanest, sweetest, or best fruit experience with this one. So having none of those things, and even the florality being a little bit more toned down, it didn't really hit on any of the marks that I'm looking for, especially for a coffee like this. So wasn't necessarily ideal or fitting for me. But that does kind of transition into the type of person I would suggest this coffee to. If you do kind of like those vibrant fruit qualities, this one had those, even if they weren't necessarily in the most sweet or clean manner. It did offer some great fruit depth and complexity, because as you saw, all 3 of the fruit factors were scoring minimum at that level 4 mark, and they all justified that mark, as you can experience a fair bit of fruit components and qualities throughout this one. If you're willing to sacrifice maybe some more of the other components, the sweetness and the clarity, of course, the 2 things that I'm highlighting the most, as well as enjoying some of the more kind of herbal qualities to the cup, then I feel like this one would probably be a pretty good fit for you. But I feel like that's the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the El Rocio wash processed Ecuador from Kawa Coffee. Thank you for watching.